There's a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much you've slept. It shows up when you're sitting in a conversation that used to excite you, and you suddenly feel like you're watching actors in a play you've seen too many times. It arrives when you're doing something you've always done, and your body simply refuses to continue. Not from weakness, from clarity. You haven't lost your mind. You found something deeper. And that something is preparing you for a complete dismantling of everything you thought you needed to be. Soren Kierkegaard called this the sickness unto death, not physical dying, but the death of the false self. And what we're about to explore might explain why you can't seem to function in your old life anymore, why normal feels like a language you're forgetting, why you're becoming a stranger to your own autobiography. Today, we're examining 7 things that begin dissolving from your life as you awaken spiritually, not through willpower or discipline, but through an organic process of outgrowing, like a snake that can no longer fit inside its old skin. These aren't choices you make. They're choices your soul makes for you. And if you've been feeling like you're becoming incompatible with reality itself, this is your confirmation. You're not falling apart. You're falling awake. The first thing that begins to evaporate is your addiction to becoming. Not ambition itself, but the relentless internal pressure to be more, achieve more, prove more, as though your existence requires constant justification through productivity. Nietzsche spent years examining what he called the will to power, but he discovered something most people miss. True power isn't the endless accumulation of achievements. It's the ability to be without needing to become. The truly powerful person, Nietzsche realized, doesn't need to prove their power. They've moved beyond the exhausting theater of constant self-improvement. Here's what starts happening as you awaken. You'll sit down to work on the next goal, the next milestone, the next version of yourself that's supposed to finally be enough, and nothing comes. Not from laziness, from completion. Your soul has stopped believing in the myth that you're insufficient as you are. A philosopher I studied under described his experience. For 30 years, I was building myself like a monument. Graduate degrees, published papers, speaking engagements, awards. Then one morning, I looked at my calendar filled with accomplishments in progress, and I felt nothing. Not depression, recognition. I'd been running from a verdict of inadequacy that was never true. The moment I stopped running, I realized I'd been enough the entire time. I just couldn't feel it while I was moving so fast. This creates a disorienting period where you're physiologically incapable of forcing yourself forward. You'll open the laptop to work on your self-improvement project, and your hands won't move. You'll sign up for the course that's supposed to fix you and never attend. You'll buy the book about becoming your best self and leave it unread. Your nervous system is staging an intervention. Kierkegaard wrote about this as the transition from the aesthetic life to the ethical life. But there's a third stage he hinted at, the life beyond constant self-construction. The life where you're no longer your own project, where you exist not as potential, but as presence. This doesn't mean you stop growing or creating. It means you stop weaponizing growth against yourself. You stop using becoming as evidence that your current self isn't acceptable. You create from fullness, not from the frantic attempt to fill an existential hole. But the withdrawal is brutal. Your entire nervous system has been wired to equate your worth with your trajectory. When the trajectory flattens, not from failure, but from arriving, your identity goes into crisis. Who are you if you're not climbing? What are you if you're not improving? The answer takes months, sometimes years, to fully land. Asterisk, you're finally here. You've finally stopped abandoning the present moment for an imaginary future where you'll finally deserve to exist. Asterisk, the second dissolution is even more destabilizing. Your ability to perform yourself convincingly begins to malfunction. The character you've been playing, competent, charming, knowledgeable, whatever your particular mask, starts glitching. And you can't fix it because something in you doesn't want to fix it. Heidegger wrote extensively about das Man, the they self, the version of you that's been constructed entirely from external expectations, social roles, inherited scripts. Most people, Heidegger observed, live their entire lives as this composite character, never touching their authentic being underneath. But as you awaken, Das Man begins to disintegrate. Not dramatically, incrementally. You'll be in the middle of telling a story you've told 100 times, and suddenly you'll hear yourself as others must hear you. Performed, calculated, designed to create a specific impression. And you'll just stop, mid-sentence, because continuing feels like suffocating. A woman I knew went through this while teaching. She'd built a whole persona. The inspiring professor, the one with perfect anecdotes, the one who always had wisdom to dispense. 20 years of standing in front of classrooms performing insight. Then one semester, she stood up to begin her usual opening lecture, carefully crafted to establish her authority and warmth, and her mouth wouldn't work. Not from fear, from refusal. Her authentic self, dormant for decades, had finally gotten strong enough to interrupt the broadcast. She told me. I realized I'd been wearing myself like a costume. Every facial expression calculated, every story selected for maximum impact, every vulnerability strategically deployed. I wasn't teaching, I was performing teaching. And that day, the actor in me just quit. I stood there in front of 40 students, completely unable to pretend, and I said, I have no idea what I'm doing. I've been pretending to know for 20 years. Can we just be honest together? It was the first real class I ever taught. This creates profound social friction. People who knew the performed version of you experience your authenticity as betrayal. You've changed, they'll say, and they mean it as an accusation. They're right, you have changed. You've stopped impersonating yourself. Heidegger would say you've moved from inauthentic to authentic existence. From living according to how one lives to living according to how you live. This sounds liberating in theory. In practice, it's terrifying. Because the performed self had survival benefits, predictability, acceptance, a clear role in the social hierarchy. The authentic self has none of these guarantees. It might be liked or rejected, celebrated or exiled. It doesn't know what it's doing from one moment to the next because it's not following a script. It's improvising truth in real time. But what happens when you can no longer perform yourself, can no longer achieve your way to worthiness? And the thing that dissolves next is the very structure you've used to understand reality itself. What happens when the conceptual frameworks that made life make sense begin to feel like cages? This is where most people turn back, where the awakening becomes too expensive, because what dissolves third might be the most precious thing you own. Before we go there, I want to acknowledge something. If you're recognizing yourself in these patterns, you're in the middle of something that most people will never understand. You need others who are walking this same edge. Subscribe to this channel and join thousands of others who are navigating the dissolution of the false and the emergence of the real. Comment below with one word describing what's dissolving in your life right now. Let's witness each other through this. Now, the third dissolution, and this one might be happening to you as we speak. The third thing that begins to disintegrate is your worldview itself. The coherent narrative you've constructed about how reality works, what it means, and how you fit into it. Not because you find a better worldview, but because worldview itself reveals itself as a limitation. Wittgenstein spent his life wrestling with this. His early work tried to build a perfect logical system that could capture reality in language. His later work was essentially an apology for that attempt, a recognition that reality is always bigger, stranger, and more alive than any conceptual framework can contain. He wrote, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." But here's what most people miss. He wasn't saying mystical truth is nonsense. He was saying it's beyond the reach of language as capture. It can only be pointed toward, never pinned down. As you awaken, you start experiencing this directly. The spiritual teachings that once felt like revelation start feeling like prisons. The psychological frameworks that once explained everything start feeling reductive. The philosophical system that once gave you certainty starts feeling like a beautiful lie. A therapist I worked with went through this crisis. She'd built her entire practice on a specific therapeutic modality, complete with theories of mind, techniques for transformation, a whole cosmology of how healing works. It gave her confidence, competence, a way to help people. Then she started waking up, and the framework started dissolving. Not because it was wrong, because it was incomplete. She could see her clients more clearly than the theory could contain. She could feel dynamics the framework had no language for. She could sense healing happening through mechanisms the model didn't account for. She told me, "I went through this period where I couldn't use my training anymore. Every time I'd start applying the technique, something in me would rebel. I could feel the aliveness of the moment, and the technique wanted to reduce it to something manageable. So I just sit there, present, not knowing, not fixing, just being with my client's reality without trying to translate it into my framework. And people healed faster, because I stopped interfering with their process by trying to understand it. This is Wittgenstein's recognition lived. Reality doesn't need your conceptual frameworks. Your frameworks need reality. And when you stop forcing reality to conform to your models, you can finally meet what is. But this creates a period of profound groundlessness. You can't explain yourself anymore. Can't defend your worldview because you don't have one. Can't recommend books or teachings because you've moved beyond belief into direct experience. People will ask, "What do you believe?" And you'll have no answer. Not from confusion, from vastness. You've discovered that beliefs are training wheels, useful until you learn to balance in naked experience. Now you're riding without them, and there's no way to explain the freedom to people still gripping their handlebars. Wittgenstein's final proposition in the Tractatus was, "He who understands me finally recognizes my propositions as nonsensical. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up it." You're throwing away ladders. All of them. Every philosophy that got you here is revealing itself as a vehicle you no longer need. You're not lost. You're finally free to wander in reality without a map dictating what you're supposed to find. The fourth dissolution destabilizes your entire experience of existence. Your orientation to time itself begins to break down. Not in a mystical everything is now bypass, but in a genuine loss of ability to live in the future-focused, past-haunted way you've always lived. Heidegger made this central to his philosophy. Inauthentic existence is always elsewhere, always not yet or no longer, always planning or regretting. Authentic existence, he argued, involves radical presence to your thrownness. The fact that you've been thrown into this moment, this life, this particular set of circumstances, and your job is not to escape it, but to be it. As awakening progresses, the future starts losing its gravitational pull, not because you become reckless or stop planning, but because the future stops feeling more real than the present. The compulsive mental time travel that's been running your life starts to short-circuit. A surgeon I knew experienced this dramatically. His entire career was built on delay of gratification, sacrificed the present for a future payoff. Medical school, residency, building a practice, decades of once I get to X, then I'll finally live. Then he woke up, and the mechanism that had driven him for 40 years simply stopped functioning. He'd be in the middle of planning his next career move, and the whole enterprise would suddenly feel absurd. Not because ambition is meaningless, but because he kept abandoning the only moment he'd ever actually inhabit. This one, he described it. I was standing in my backyard, mentally rehearsing a presentation for next month, when I realized I'd done this same thing 10,000 times. I'd stood in 10,000 moments, fully absent, preparing for a future moment that would arrive, and I'd also be absent from, planning for the next one. I'd never actually been anywhere. I'd spent my entire life in a moment that doesn't exist, 5 minutes from now. This realization broke his relationship with time. He couldn't make himself care about long-term goals the way he used to. Couldn't motivate himself through future rewards. Couldn't suffer through the present for a better tomorrow. Not from hedonism, from sanity. He'd finally seen through the con. The present moment is the only moment that ever exists, and he'd been taught to treat it as an obstacle to somewhere better. Heidegger calls this anticipatory resoluteness, not ignoring the future, but being present to your mortality, your finitude, the fact that all your moments are limited. This doesn't lead to paralysis, it leads to presence. You stop squandering the present because you finally realize it's all you have. But this creates profound dissonance with a culture addicted to becoming. Career planning feels hollow. 5-year plans feel absurd. Sacrificing today for tomorrow feels like a form of insanity. You can still function, still create, still build, but you can't do it by abandoning the now. The fifth thing that dissolves is subtler, but perhaps more foundational. The stories you tell about your feelings begin to lose their coherence. The emotional narratives that have organized your inner life. I'm anxious because, I'm angry because, I feel this way due to, start revealing themselves as after-the-fact explanations, not actual causes. Spinoza saw this centuries ago. He wrote that humans are conscious of their actions, but ignorant of the causes whereby those actions are determined. We feel something, then immediately create a story about why we feel it. The story feels true because it arrives so quickly, but it's almost always a post hoc rationalization. As you awaken, you start catching this mechanism in action. You'll feel a wave of anxiety and notice your mind immediately scanning for what you're anxious about, creating a narrative, selecting a villain, constructing a plot line. But if you stay with the sensation itself, refusing the story, something extraordinary happens. The feeling exists without a cause. It's just energy moving through your nervous system, requiring no explanation, no meaning, no narrative at all. A writer I studied with went through this dissolution. She'd built an entire literary career on understanding her emotions, mining her inner life for meaning, translating feelings into narratives, making sense of her psyche through story. Then the process stopped working. She'd feel something intense and reach for the narrative, and nothing. The feeling was there, vivid and alive, but it wouldn't cohere into a story. It was just sensation, energy, movement, refusing to be captured by plot. She told me. I realized I'd been narrativizing my entire inner life. Every feeling immediately became, I feel this because my mother, or this is happening because I'd never actually felt anything. I'd only interpreted feelings through story. When the story-making broke down, I finally met my actual emotional life. It's not a narrative. It's not even personal. It's just the weather of being, moving through this particular body. Spinoza would say she'd moved from inadequate ideas, stories, to direct apprehension. She wasn't repressing the narratives. She was seeing through them to the raw reality underneath. This creates a strange relationship with psychology. Therapy often tries to construct better narratives about your feelings. But what if the problem isn't the narrative's accuracy? It's that your feelings don't actually need narratives. What if they're just asking to be felt, not understood? You might find yourself unable to explain your emotions anymore. Someone asks why you're sad, and you have no answer. Not because you're repressing, because the sadness doesn't have a because. It's just here, like weather, like the movement of wind through trees. This terrifies people who've built their identity on emotional sophistication. I'm someone who understands their feelings was a point of pride. Now you can't even locate the feelings as separate, narrative-able objects. They're just part of the seamless flow of being alive. Now, if you think the dissolution stops at your relationship with time and emotion, you're not prepared for what comes next. Because what dissolves sixth is so fundamental that most spiritual teachings don't even acknowledge it's possible to lose. In fact, most teachings are built on protecting this one thing, and your awakening is about to dismantle it completely. Stay with me, because this is where it gets truly disorienting. The sixth thing that evaporates, and this might be the most disorienting of all, is your identity as someone on a spiritual path. Not your spiritual awareness itself, but the whole framework of seeking, practicing, progressing toward enlightenment. Alan Watts spent his life pointing at this paradox. The spiritual search is the problem masquerading as the solution. The seeker is what's keeping you from what you're seeking. Awakening, he insisted, isn't a destination you arrive at through spiritual practices. It's what's here when you stop seeking. But try telling that to someone who's built their entire life around spiritual development. Their bookshelves lined with teachings, their days structured around practices, their identity wrapped up in being someone who's consciously evolving. The seeker identity feels noble, purposeful, meaningful. Then something shifts. You sit down to meditate and realize you're using meditation to become someone who meditates. You read another spiritual book and see yourself collecting wisdom like merit badges. You attend another retreat and notice you're measuring your consciousness level against others. The whole enterprise reveals itself as another ego project, just with spiritual aesthetics. A meditation teacher I knew went through this dissolution publicly. She'd built a successful practice teaching mindfulness, thousands of students, published books, conference keynotes. Her whole identity was person who helps others wake up. Then she woke up to something more fundamental. She'd been using teaching wakefulness to avoid being awake herself. The teaching was a protection, a way to stay in the seeker role while appearing to have found. A way to remain separate from the very unity she was describing. She told her students, "I've been lying to you and to myself. I don't know anything about enlightenment. I've read about it, talked about it, guided others toward it, but I've never stopped seeking long enough to realize what's already here. I've made a career out of professional seeking, and now that identity is dissolving, and I don't know who I am without it." This is what's called the backwards law. The more you seek, the less you find, because seeking itself reinforces the illusion that you lack what you're seeking. You're already what you're looking for. But the seeker identity can't accept this because it would mean the death of the seeker. As this identity dissolves, your relationship with spiritual practice transforms completely. You might still meditate, but not to become enlightened, just because sitting quietly is pleasant. You might still read philosophy, but not to accumulate wisdom, because ideas are beautiful. You might still explore consciousness, but not as a ladder to climb, as a landscape to wander. The desperation evaporates. The grasping stops. And paradoxically, this is when genuine spiritual depth actually begins, not as seeking, but as being, not as becoming enlightened, but as recognizing you've never been anything other than consciousness itself, temporarily convinced it was a separate seeker looking for its own existence. This feels like falling, like losing your purpose, like betraying your spiritual commitments. But Watts would say it's actually the first moment of honesty. You've finally stopped using spirituality as a defense against the present moment. The seventh and final dissolution is the most comprehensive. The deep, mostly unconscious belief that your life should be other than it begins to evaporate, not through positive thinking or spiritual bypassing, but through a genuine recognition that your resistance to reality is the only actual problem. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, taught this relentlessly. You suffer not from events, but from your judgments about events. Not from reality, but from your insistence that reality be different. The universe is exactly as it should be in every moment. Your war with what is the source of all psychological suffering. But knowing this intellectually and embodying it are separated by years of dissolution. Because your entire personality has been constructed around subtle resistance. My life will be complete when I'll be happy once. Things will be better if, as awakening deepens, this resistance starts to feel absurd. Not wrong, absurd. You'll catch yourself arguing with reality and suddenly hear how preposterous it sounds. This traffic shouldn't be here. Why? Says who? Based on what authority are you declaring that the universe has made an error by creating this traffic in this moment? A chronic pain patient I worked with embodied this shift. She'd spent 15 years at war with her body, fighting the pain, researching cures, trying every treatment, living in a state of constant resistance to her physical reality. Then something broke open. She was lying in bed in the middle of a pain flare, doing her usual mental warfare. This shouldn't be happening. I can't live like this. This has to change. When she suddenly heard the absurdity. She was arguing with sensation. She was trying to negotiate with nerve signals. She was at war with her own nervous system. She stopped fighting, not because she accepted the pain, because she finally saw that the suffering wasn't the pain, it was her resistance to the pain. The pain was just sensation. The suffering was her constant mental narrative that this sensation shouldn't exist. She told me, the pain didn't go away, but my suffering did. I stopped living in an alternate universe where my body was supposed to be different. I came home to the body I actually have, in the life I actually have. And something I can't explain happened. I became free inside my limitations. Not free from them, free with them. This is Epictetus lived. Freedom isn't changing your circumstances. It's releasing your argument with your circumstances. You stop demanding that reality apologize for not conforming to your preferences. But this doesn't create passivity. It creates responsibility. When you're not wasting energy resisting what is, you have full energy available to respond to what is. You're not trying to make reality match your fantasy. You're engaging reality as it actually presents itself. The dissolution of life should be different is the death of the conditional self. The self that says, I'll be okay when you discover something shocking. You're already okay. Not because your life got perfect, but because okayness was never dependent on circumstances. It's the ground of being itself. If you've stayed with me through these 7 dissolutions, you've likely recognized yourself at multiple points. Maybe you're in the middle of one of these unravelings right now, sitting in the rubble of an identity that no longer fits, grieving a way of being that's dying, terrified of what's emerging. Epictetus would remind you, you're not losing anything real. You're losing illusions. And yes, illusions can be painful to release because you've built your entire sense of self on them. But what's being revealed underneath isn't emptiness. It's your actual existence, finally freed from the exhausting performance of being someone you were never meant to be. These dissolutions aren't happening to you. They're happening as you. Your truest self is dissolving everything false. Your deepest wisdom is dismantling everything constructed. Your authentic being is emerging not by addition, but by subtraction. And here's what none of these philosophers quite say explicitly, but all of them point toward. This process accelerates in community. When you find others who are also dissolving, who can witness your unraveling without trying to fix you, who can sit in the groundlessness with you, the terror becomes bearable. The confusion becomes shared navigation. The loneliness becomes conscious connection. This is why I created this channel, not to give you more spiritual concepts to collect, but to create space for those of us who are falling apart in the most sacred way. We're not broken, we're breaking open. If this resonates, subscribe and become part of this community of the beautifully dissolving. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next exploration. And most importantly, comment below with which dissolution you're experiencing right now. Just one sentence. Because someone else needs to know they're not alone in exactly what you're moving through. In our next video, we're exploring the terrifying and exhilarating space after the dissolutions. What emerges when the false self has finally died and you're left with the raw presence of being itself? What lives on the other side of all this falling apart? Until then, remember Epictetus. Wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants. Your dissolutions are making you cosmically wealthy. You're losing everything false and gaining everything true. The unraveling is the return. The dissolution is the resolution. You're not falling apart. You're falling into what you've always been.